So I'm here today to talk to you about how there is no such thing as passive spectatorship. And although you're seated in a really comfortable, nice auditorium, and it's climate controlled, and it's dark in here, and you're probably feeling very lulled, and nobody has stormed the stage yet, which happens to me disturbingly often, you might feel passive, you're feeling relaxed and chill, but it's not the case. If you're watching me move around, and if you're following me as I'm talking, your brain is engaged in a flurry of psychological, emotional, and neurological work. So you're not being passive, you're working. Welcome to my life, we're working every minute. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is how things like TED Talks are actually theatrical events. I'm going to talk to you about why it matters what we look at in theatrical events. And lastly, I'm going to give you permission for the first time in your life to really stare at other people. We all remember the admonishments, right? Don't stare, it's rude to stare. And my favorite, can you put the first slide up for me? Put your eyes back in your head. I love this one because it's so vivid. And when I was thinking of this, I saw this cartoon in my head, and then I was really happy when Google gave it to me. Because look at this, we're so interested in another person that we'll figuratively pop our eyes out in order to get the person in. And I think it's vivid, it's wonderful. This is who we are. And in admonishing us not to stare throughout our childhoods, our families are teaching us to suppress, and I would say pervert, something very fundamental about us as people, which is that we live to watch other people. It's who we are. And the place where we as a culture first developed ways of watching other people constructively is the theater. And so I'm a theater person, and I'm going to be here and talk about theater for my little time with you today. We get the word theater from the Greek. The word is theatron, and it means the place for seeing. It refers to the auditorium, which is where all of you are sitting. You're in the place for seeing, and I'm on the stage. Aristotle looked at the phenomenon of people going to the theater in his time, and he said, wow, people really love this, and I think they love it because it speaks to the most fundamental aspect of who we are, which is that we are mimetic creatures, and by that he meant we learn by imitation. We see this most clearly in babies, and I like to go there. Babies learn everything by imitation, and an easy example is language, because they come out of the womb and they have no language, right? And all they do is cry, or not cry. But they watch us, and as they're watching us, they see that all we do is talk nonstop. And so they start to imitate, and they start to make sounds, and those sounds move from babble to words, and then from words to the entire language of their native tongue in 2 years, and it's miraculous. As we grow up, we like to distance ourselves from that. We think that's childish. We think we learn more by reason and rationality, but I'm here to tell you that you still learn by imitation. Every time you watch another person, you are being deeply affected by the experience of watching that person. And I'm going to tell you how that works, because we first figured it out in the theater. So, back to Aristotle and the Greeks. This was 2,500 years ago. The theater was all the rage in ancient Greece, and Aristotle was going to the theater, and he hypothesized that the reason that people loved the theater is because they were getting caught up in it. He saw reactions happening in that seeing place. He said, wow, people watch this show, and they identify so much with the main character and the actions that he takes, that when the play reaches its climax, they're experiencing not just an emotional, but they're experiencing a physical release. He called it catharsis, and catharsis just means purging, a purging of emotion. And what is purging? It's a physical activity. It's vomiting. So I want you to get the sense that we've noticed this from the very beginning. And it's not just in Greek theater. Any culture that uses theater as a place to gather together, to look at other people, and to look at human action, has seen that there's something incredibly powerful that happens when we look at characters on a stage so that we can kind of isolate action. When we're watching something happen on a stage, We are identifying with the person who is moving and acting, and we are internalizing their actions, and then we think about the thought processes that went into that action. And so all cultures talk about this, whether it's Sanskrit theater, Greek theater, Roman theater, Elizabethan theater, we're all obsessed with this in the theater world. Fast forward a little bit, fast forward kind of to now, and we still talk about how this works, this give and take of observation and imitation, and we talk about it kind of socially. We call it the theory of mind. We say that socially I watch you, and I'm seeing you move, and I'm trying to guess what you're going to do next. So we have philosophical terms that describe this same activity that happens in the theater. We watch other people because sometimes we're nervous, right? What are you going to do? Are you going to rob me? Are you going to hit me? Sometimes we're hopeful. Are you going to give me a present? My daughter approaches everyone hopeful, like, maybe you have candy. So if someone's hand goes in their pocket, she perks right up, right? But this is how we learn about people. We hypothesize from their actions, and it's really powerful. Neuroscience, however, even more recently than social science and philosophy, has found some interesting things out. We have in our brain a whole class of neurons that they're calling the mirror neuron system. I promise this talk is about theater, we'll get there. Neuroscientists have found this branch of brain circuitry that they're calling the mirror neuron system, and it confirms what Aristotle observed over 2,500 years ago, that when we watch other people, we're not sitting there just passive images in front of my face. No, when you're watching other people move, these mirror neurons engage and they reflect back to the brain every action the person makes that you're watching. The brain is, in a sense, imagining itself doing the same actions. And so you're watching me wave my hand, and as you're watching me wave my hand, your brain is imagining you wave your hand. But it stops short of actual motion. They've tested this, it's science. I may be a theater person, but I trust them because they're scientists. It's really cool stuff. And so the mirror neuron system is super exciting. It confirms what the theater has been telling us for thousands of years. And I'm obsessed. Can you tell I'm obsessed with how we see? I'm a theater artist and a scholar of performance and phenomenology, so I'm really interested in what we see and how it appears to us. That's kind of the basic definition of phenomenology. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and why on earth I learned words like neuroscience and human mirror neuron system. I founded a theater 5 years ago. You heard about it in the introduction, called Paper Sky Theater. And I founded it because I was so interested in how communities see and how they can use the theater to see things together. How we can see each other, how we can see specifically needs within our community, and how we can see and talk about our own pasts. And I was doing a lot of theater with that theater. I was doing what I've now come to call ordinary theater, except that sometimes people storm the stage. Again, look into it. It's really interesting in theater. People do get out of their chairs a lot. And I was doing theater, plays, comedies, tragedies, when a friend approached me and asked me if I would consider doing theater sessions with teenagers at a camp for teenagers with autism. I had no experience with this whatsoever, and this started pretty much about 5 or 6 years ago. And so I had to learn a lot about people with autism. And one thing I learned is that those with autism do not engage in the same dynamic of observation and imitation that neurotypical people do, it seems. And so when you are doing theater activities with people with autism, you need to find other ways of communicating. Autism is a really interesting condition, and neuroscience has kind of clued in that it might have something to say to the puzzle that is autism. You'll often see autism organizations represent themselves with a puzzle piece because it is a puzzle that so many different fields are trying to understand. And so neuroscience has started to look at autism, and it said, wow, these people often don't engage in imitation like neurotypical people do. And so they've studied the brains of those with autism, and they have found that yes, there is, it seems, a deficiency or a disruption in the mirror neuron system. Those with autism, that mirror neuron system doesn't engage. And I've come to understand a lot of this through doing theater and researching techniques in theater for those with autism. There have been some really interesting new experiments that have found that you can train the brain through neurofeedback training, and that if teenagers with autism, I read one really good study, go through this neurofeedback training, they show improvement in the ability to recognize other people's intentions and moods. This is seen as a big deficiency in those with autism. And they also show a reduction in what are called problematic behaviors, which leads to what the medical community calls deficiencies in social skills, which is part of the diagnosis of autism. And this is all very exciting in the realm of neuroscience and treatment. But I'm a theater artist, and so deficiency doesn't get me very far, as I've been trying to figure out how do I make theater with communities with autism. Deficiency is a medical term, it works great for them. But for me, I have learned through much work with amateur theater artists that if I approach you only in terms of your deficiencies, you will not give me a very good performance. All you'll hear is that voice in your head saying, "You're really bad, talk louder, face the audience, try to act." Deficiency doesn't get me very far as an artist. But also as a scholar of performance history, deficiency makes me straight out nervous. And so you may not know, but in the long history of how we've taught people what normal is and what normal human behavior is and normal physical variations are, the theater was used long before television and internet to teach people about what normal is and therefore what deficiency is. So I'll just tell you a little bit about this long history of performances of weird, I like to call it, right? How do we see crazy? To start with, crazy. It was all the rage way back in the 18th and 19th centuries if you were a person of means and lived close enough to an insane asylum to head out on the weekend and see the crazy people. I don't know, I don't see the appeal, but it was a really hot thing to do. Medicine. When medicine first started as a profession and surgery started, they built operating rooms on the model of theaters, and they're still called operating theaters, especially in big teaching hospitals. And they have these large galleries of seating up above the operating room so that you can get a view of the body. You can see the diseased part of the body, right? Because the rest of the person is curtained off with drapes. And what else can you see? You can see the surgeon and the surgeon's skills at repairing the body. There are more. Freak shows are an interesting way in which we learned about what normal is. Rosemary Garland Thompson has this really great book called Extraordinary Bodies, and in one chapter she talks about the history of the American freak show, which I knew nothing about before I read her book. But she tells us that the American freak show was developed in part to kind of create a common American identity of normal, and to do that you needed someone who was weird. You needed the freaks, and that helped bond us together as a culture of going to the circus and going to see the freak show. This also happened in the 18th and 19th centuries on a really big political global scale as Western powers sort of started to expand and colonize. Some of them colonized or just developed really dominant networks of trade around the world. It was all the rage for nations in Europe and the United States to host things like the World's Fair or colonial exhibitions. And part of what would happen at these is that you would go and you would file past displays of different cultures. It looks a little bit like the Epcot World Showcase, I will tell you honestly. But it was a way to go and see like Papua New Guinea, to see the religious practices of places like Bali. There would be people from these places, there would be artifacts and handicrafts, and there would be performances. And one effect of these performances, which is what they were because they weren't authentic, was that it helped Europeans and Americans to get a sense of what it meant to be Western and to be white against other races, so it's us and them. So you just get this kind of innately through watching performances when you're watching people as specimens rather than as people. So that is a little bit of the history of how theater helps to teach normalcy. Those are displays. But then also at this time period, the 18th and 19th century, before there was TV and before there was internet and before there was YouTube, you would go and hear public lectures. And these looked exactly like this, except there were no microphones or PowerPoints. But you would go in here, you wanted to learn the latest ideas about natural science and social sciences. And these were all the rage. Again, amongst the educated classes, people with money, you would go in here and the latest things. Marla Schweitzer has a wonderful article about these public lectures, and she looks at how the lecturer would just put a whole bunch of artifacts out and talk about them. And one of her major points is that what you're looking at, what the audience then would be looking at in these lectures, wasn't necessarily the objects, but was the lecturer himself. She looks at this history and says that these lecturers had to perfect what she calls an inner stillness, a dominance, right? I am the one who knows, and I will dominate with my strength, my stillness, my expertise, both the objects in front of me and the audience out there. And so when you are looking at the lecturer is a performer. Would you advance to the next slide, please? So here is a great cartoon from the period. It's a satire of one of these lectures, and you can see this dynamic at play. The lecturer is there in the blue coat, and around him are all of these specimens that he's talking about, and he is tall, he's dynamic, he's got this pose. That's an energetic pose. That's someone who is over the items in front of him, including the audience. But what really interests me in this picture is that row of gentlemen in the front who are imitating his posture. So to go back to what I started with, right? They are watching the lecturer and they are imitating the lecturer, even down to the person on the end holding the skull, right, as something to possess. And I find this very interesting as a scholar of performance history. So lecturers back then would just bring all sorts of stuff, right? And so this is a phrenologist, and he has a bunch of skulls, and he has busts of people, and he's talking about how different head shapes tell us about different people. But you also would have people, lecturers who would bring out actual people on the stage and talk about them while they were there. And the most famous example of this is a person called Sarah Bartman. And you might know about Sarah Bartman because this is probably the most famous example. But she was called the Hottentot Venus, and she was displayed throughout Europe. She was from South Africa. She was displayed throughout Europe during her very short life as an example of an extreme type of African female body type. And she died very young in a very painful condition. And one thing that's interesting about Sarah Bartman is that even though she was dead, her body continued to be displayed until 1976 in a museum in Paris when it was finally taken down, but it took until 2002 for her remains to be returned to South Africa. And so the people of South Africa demanded her back after hundreds of years. And in that demand, they show us that what is displayed on the stage does really matter. Can you go to the next slide, please? So at this point, you are trained because you are smart people. You go to lectures, you're probably in school, many of you, and you know how this works, this kind of performance. So you're expecting for me to ask the person to click, and that then we'll see a picture of Sarah Bartman and her extraordinary, no, don't go, I didn't tell you, go back. Thank you. He's ready, right? He's like, let's see it. What is it? What makes her so strange? But I'm not going to show you Sarah Bartman's whatever. I'm sure you might Google it later. I made sure to spell her name correctly for you, because that's not the point. I want you to question this very dynamic of using the theater as a place to observe and dissect people according to difference. I want to challenge that. Although lecturers no longer bring a pile of stuff on stage like a bunch of random heads, although that would be pretty spectacular, and I kind of wish I had grabbed a big bag, rolled them out. We do bring bits of people. Okay, now advance the slide and move quickly as rehearsed, right? We just have digitized our props into PowerPoint slides, so now here they are, right? We've got people, extraordinary bits of difference. We've got the biological world sprinkled in there. Stop, we gotta stop right there. And this is how we now look at people and try to understand the world and atomize the world. And I'm not saying don't do that. I'm not saying don't be a social scientist, don't be an anthropologist. No, do those things. But when we engage in seeing in a performance level, we should always be questioning, what am I imitating when I'm watching another person? Because if I can get you to understand how powerful the act of watching is, you'll change what you look at for the rest of your life. And you'll look for ways to use your abilities to help others to see needs in your own community. You'll be able to engage on that level with the dynamic of seeing. So just to conclude my story, I became so interested in seeing and how we see theatrically when I was young and when I was conducting research into performance histories. But since I had this invitation several years ago, my interest in how we see and how others see us has only deepened. There's a wonderful philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas, and please advance the slide. He writes that our duty to other people begins in the very moment of perception. And when we perceive another person, what is enacted is a call to us, a complete responsibility for that other person. Remember when I told you when my daughter sees another person reach in their pocket, she expects candy? Levinas tells us that really at our base, whenever we see another person, we either expect them to hurt us or to help us. And that's a really demanding thing that should call out to you and make you rethink how you see other people. Hi, can you move the slide forward? And then once more. For Levinas, he says, and once more. Oh no, yeah, one more, thank you. He says when we meet that other person, whether he looks at me or not, that person regards me and I must answer for him. This happens in the seeing place all the time, right? Whether the person on the stage is there as a specimen, doesn't look at you, right? Specimen, a bust, a body part, an inert body on a table, a slave brought to be talked about, or not, you are nonetheless responsible for talking about what you saw, for processing what you saw because it's affecting you. So for me, working with those with autism, I've had to do a lot of research to understand exactly how they see the world so that then I can see them better and that we together can create theater. Because again, that was the goal all along. Wasn't to just trot through theater history or learn a little bit about neuroscience. It's all been about creating theater with a community that even though it may not speak, it is creative and it has a story to tell. So I'll just tell you probably one of the most interesting things I found in this work, which is though those with autism don't engage in what we call normal, right, patterns of observation and imitation, nonetheless, I have found that they are regarding me all the time. We play a game in the theater called the mirror game, and you may have seen something similar to this if I have any I Love Lucy fans in the room. In the episode when I Love Lucy and Harpo do that mirror routine, right, where Harpo comes out and Lucy's dressed exactly like Harpo Marx, and they mirror each other exactly. It's a very old theater routine, and we use it as a theater game. It helps to develop connection and communication. It practices your watching skills because you're trying to watch all of the person while not focusing on any one thing at any one time. This is a really great game for theater people. This game works in reverse so much better when trying to build a collaborative group between neurotypical peers and those with autism. You know, you can bang your head against the wall over and over again saying, watch me do what I do, watch me do what I do, and getting nowhere. And I was doing that as a very young and inexperienced theater camp leader. And then one day I had the thought, why don't we just flip the mirror around? I'll watch you, I'll do whatever you do. Whatever you do, I'll do it. And let's do the mirror game with you as the person and me as the mirror. And what we found, and this project is ongoing, I still do these theater activities with communities with autism, is that when you reverse the mirror, when you let the other person be the person, that avenues of communication and creativity open up where they hadn't been there before. And it's just incredibly powerful. And I have no explanation for why it's so. And I'm really excited for neuroscience to develop far enough to tell me why it works. But I'll be like Aristotle, and I'll just give you my observation. The other person is regarding me. I know it because he sees me mirroring him in this theater game. And so I found it's my responsibility to keep telling that story, that work, and the importance of that work in the context of the theater for creating a more just society. You have your own story. You have your own people you meet every day. How will you see them, and whose story are you going to tell? Thank you.